So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Anthony Powers I'm the director of Reentry for the Seattle Clemency Project. I'm somebody with lived experience. I've spent 26 years in prison. I went in when I was 16 years of age. And when I was incarcerated, I was the founder of the Redemption Project. I did many other things, but some of those things that I did actually helped me with my own reentry, including questioning over 100 people on what led them back to prison until I saw the patterns of what led to recidivism. And that's what we're gonna speak on today, mitigating some of those issues. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Gail. I too am formerly incarcerated. I got locked up when I was 15 years old and with 50-year sentence. So thankfully, due to new laws in Washington regarding juveniles, I was released about 1.5 years ago after doing 25 years. Since I've been home, I've had the honor of working with Senator Jeannie Darnell this last legislative session. And I'm now currently a paralegal at a defense law firm in Seattle with Tolan Law Firm. I'm going to have my BA in a couple months and plan on pursuing law. And I'm just very passionate about criminal justice reform. And I'm happy to be here today to share a collective experience that we've all had with reentry. Alyssa?
Hi, I'm Alyssa Knight. I also have lived experience. I actually just released from WCCW in March of this year. I was incarcerated at the age of 21, and so I spent most of my 20s and 30s incarcerated. So while I was in, I helped start the Freedom Education Project Puget Sound, which was a degree-bearing program, the first one at WCCW since we lost Pell Grants. And then I was also involved with quite a few different programs inside Prison Pet Partnership, as well as Yoga Behind Bars. All programs that really helped me upon release. So since I have been back in the community, I have been involved with the Seattle Clemency Project as well as Yoga Behind Bars. And I actually still had 5 years left on my sentence, but thanks to Seattle Clemency Project, I was afforded an attorney who helped me apply for clemency/commutation. And so I was granted commutation by Governor Inslee in March of this year. And so I was released early. Grady?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Grady Mitchell. I was incarcerated at the age of 24 in 1983. I'm currently 62 years of age. I did 37 years of incarceration in Washington State. I'm currently the Corrections and Reentry Program Director for our organization, or Roots of Success. I'm really glad to be here today. I'm glad to be a part of the Seattle Clemency Project. I too was released January 28th, 2021 of this year by the Honorable Governor Jay Inslee for a lot of accomplishments and achievements that I really appreciated and enjoyed doing along with some colleagues while I was incarcerated. But I think the greatest compliment would have to go to the Seattle Clemency Project for their representation of those compliments. So I'm just really glad and humbled to be here today.
Okay, so as we get started, I would like to point out to everybody who's in attendance that many of us know when it comes to mass incarceration, they designed a system to where they put everything in place to make sure that mass incarceration was a success. So a lot of those things that they put in place were barriers to reentry. They were barriers that led to people coming back to prison, because we all know when people get released, that reduces prison numbers. And if they're trying to increase prison numbers, then the more people they can have go back, the more likely they are to make a profit out of those who are incarcerated. So when it comes to mitigating the barriers of reentry, we have to identify the things that were put in place that led to mass incarceration, and then start systematically dismantling those things and putting things in place so that we can ensure when it comes to mass decarceration, which is a growing movement, then all those pieces are put in place to make sure that is a success, just like they put all the pieces in place to make sure that mass incarceration was a success. Next slide. So a lack of any of the following can be detrimental to a person's successful reentry/reintegration. I know a lot of these are animated, so for a healthy environment inside of prisons. 2, proper education and preparation for society. 3, proper documentation upon release. 4, necessary resources upon release. And 5, a healthy social network to receive them upon release. So for each one of these points, we're going to expand on these further as a group. So next slide. So a healthy environment inside of prisons, the principle of normality. So the Nordic model, which Washington State Department of Corrections is actually talking about going to, they have the lowest recidivism in the world. So if you can add the numbers, Norway's recidivism is 20%. The United States recidivism is 76.6%. And the funny thing about that is America counts felonies as recidivism. Norway will count if you get a ticket as recidivism, right? So even with a higher standard of what recidivism means, of what somebody re-engaging in the justice involved process means, even with these things, they still have over 3 times less, almost 4 times less likelihood of people re-engaging in the criminal justice system or be involved in the criminal justice system who have been inside of the prisons. But they have something called the principle of normality. And the principle of normality is simply saying, treat somebody like a human being. Treat somebody like the person who you want to live next door to you. And by treating people like a human being, having it be a place where they learn the things they need to do socially, economically, when it comes to work, and they have an environment where the staff inside of prisons don't, call people by their last names and try to do anything and everything to dehumanize the individual, but instead they try to treat them like a human being, the principle of normality, treat them like a normal person, then they have a drastically reduced recidivism. People are much more likely to get out and be productive citizens, which means they're getting out and they are being healthy members of society and contributing to public safety. Next slide. Alyssa, you want to take this?
Sure. So proper education and preparation for society. We paired many of these things or lumped many of these things together, having higher education, vocational training, social preparation, and technological training. So they're all things that you may take for granted, but they're all things that actually are really preparing you to be normalized when you step out of prison and into society. Next slide. Oh yeah, and mental health and wellness. Sorry, I forgot about that one, which we will touch on later. Higher education. So the interesting thing with higher education, there's lots of vocational education programs that exist inside of prison, but there was not a track for higher education once Pell money was taken from prisons. And so that was something that, at least at WCCW, and I know at many of the other prisons inside of Washington State, that we fought for, because not just because of college education is good, right? Like this slide says, for every 1 year of higher education, recidivism rates drop by 50%. The fact of the matter is that isn't just because getting a degree makes you successful. There's so many things that you learn inside of a classroom, like responsibility and time management and confidence and the ability to voice your needs, to have agency, to know that your words have value. The way that you communicate with your peers and with authority in a classroom. These are all things that actually translate outside of the classroom, and why those rates drop so much. Not just because now you're prepared for a career, which is true, because most careers, instead of a job, are actually going to require you to have some sort of degree just to show that you have the ability to complete something. But it's actually those values that you learn inside of the classroom that are really enhancing your ability to step out as a human being and say, okay, I was here, but my lived experience is only that part of it, right? I step out and I'm able to actually function and focus inside of society and use all those things that I learned in the classroom to make sure that I have agency and am stable outside in the community.
Yeah, and when we look at those numbers, right? 50%, when you're going from 76.6%, 50% is cutting it down to in the 30s, right? And then one more year, 50% is cutting it down to the teens.
Right.
So when we talk about recidivism, I mean, it's really just a fancy word for somebody got victimized, right? Because when somebody goes back to prison, that means somebody else got victimized in society, right? So for every 50%, that's that many more people who are less likely to be victimized. And for those of us who had long amounts of time in prison, like myself, you, Alyssa, Gail, and Grady, and many others, we don't have the opportunity a lot of times, unless we create our own opportunities, we don't have the opportunity to take these classes. So when these changes come along, like Miller versus Alabama, or the changes come along like 5164 with the 3 strikes, or other changes, other criminal justice reforms, these are the people who have done long amounts of time in prison who haven't been afforded these opportunities because of how much time they had. When if everybody would be invested in, then if these things do come along, these individuals are going to be much more likely to be released. And another side note of that is, even if somebody doesn't get out, those people still have an influence on the people who are getting out. 97% of people are getting out of prison. So for the people who aren't getting out, I mean, I know one of the guys that I mentored, he came to prison for a nonviolent crime his first time, right? And I've mentored him on his 4th time in prison. But he came to prison, started getting caught up in the prison lifestyle, joined a gang, went out to Centralia where there weren't gangs at the time, and based off the gang he joined in prison, he brought that gang to Centralia. Rival gang pops up like they always do, I don't know why, but that also opened up the drug routes from Yakima to Centralia. Drug routes increased from Yakima to Hopium, then they went from Hopium to Abercrombie. And I was actually locked up with some of the guys who were responsible for opening up those drug routes, so I knew the whole backstory. But the whole point is that one individual who was part of the 97% getting out was influenced, and it changed 3 cities in Washington State. So imagine if on the flip side, people were more invested, people had more hope, and he was less likely to be negatively influenced and more likely to be positively influenced based off how the prison system is run. Then those are 3 cities and all the ripple effect of the people in those cities who wouldn't have had those negative things happen as a result of how this one person was influenced negatively in prison. Next slide. Grady?
Vocational training. Man, I think it's really important that when we look at vocational training, they're really relevant to the person that's releasing. And so when we look at the many instances of it, how many people are getting released that absolutely have none whatsoever? And so as we go down the bullet points, that this can always be accomplished, as a service to give back to society. For example, the trades are projected to be higher paid as not enough people are getting involved with them. So while incarcerated, we had a couple of trades that came in, and we're actually looking for individuals in that category to come out into the construction trades. And the requirement simply was, to the pre-apprenticeship and things of this nature. So additionally, when we look at the tech jobs that could be available, and I believe Alyssa could speak a lot more to this. I believe it was Alyssa. And so a lot of things with the technical job, they're outdated. A lot of the training and things that we're seeing inside of prison, they don't really relate to current practices that are in society today. So there's a really, really greater need to increase this. I guess I should say the vocational training that's provided inside the prison. I'm sure some other colleagues can speak a little bit more to this because they've experienced it.
Yeah, so just to add to the vocational training, so especially at WCCW, I spent the last year that I was inside learning how to code in our web development program, which was really great in a lot of ways. It taught me a lot. It gave me the ability to know how to run a laptop, which I would not have had access to otherwise. The problem is that even in the most relevant training, if there isn't that step to help you actually enter the field when you're released, then there's no way. If I can't get a laptop, or I can't obtain a computer, or I don't know how to get online to access the internet in order to apply for a job, or how to create a resume, these are all missing pieces that I can't actually apply all of the training that I used. Whereas I was involved with another program that was vocational training, and I would say it is probably one of maybe 2 success stories for WCCW, but the Prison Pet Partnership trained me in how to be a dog groomer. But the next step that they took was to make sure that I had a job when I released, and to also make sure that I had all of the tools that I needed in order to be able to do my job. So that is actually where I'm currently working, is as a dog groomer, making a very good living because that program was full service. And that's the piece that we're missing in this vocational training. So much money is being funneled into vocational training. And it is bringing a lot of money into the prison. And it is creating a program for people to do and to keep themselves busy, but it's missing the piece that would actually like be the measure to say that it was success, which was people being placed in successful careers once they were released.
So, and a lot of those vocational skills, as we look at them, while the PR side of things may sound great if you just go for the PR methodology, in practice, okay, I worked for years at the metal plant, which is the license plate factory. Unfortunately, the only place to make license plates in the state is in the penitentiary. So in order for me to get that job, I'd have to go back to the penitentiary. And I'm not willing to do that. And a lot of the equipment they have was really made and manufactured like back in the 60s. So even the equipment that we were trained to use and utilize is really outdated, as well as I worked in the garment factory, sewing clothes. I mean, I'm flabbergasted as, you know, there's no sewing plants around here. I know how to sew very well, you know, but the opportunities for a job and connecting that gap is just isn't there, just isn't available. I believe, Wally, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just saying, you know,
Anthony?
before we get to, you know, the deeper dive into the issues with these vocational classes, I just wanted to reiterate that a lot of times it comes down to people applying themselves and doing something that's more extraordinary, like Gail did, right? She applied herself, learned the law, and now she's doing the amazing work of actually working at a law firm, right? After spending so much time in prison. So, but we can't rely on people being extraordinary. That can't be the standard, you know? When some of these people were doing drugs with their mom when they're 9 years old, we can't expect them to then be these extraordinary individuals and take all the steps they need to take. We need to have a system where we have taxpayer dollars being invested in these things. They're being invested in things that are actually going to help the individuals in the way that they need it. So next slide. So the trades, HVAC. So first, HVAC, residential burglary. This is one of the flaws in the current system, right? They'll bring in programs, but there won't be deep thought put into it, right? So like HVAC, you can't get a job doing HVAC if you have a residential burglary. Nobody's going to hire you, right? So it's like, yeah, learn all the HVAC. Maybe they've been watching too many Hollywood movies where somebody hit a diamond in the HVAC system and had to come back from prison and break back into the place, right? But if you have a residential burglary, which a lot of the men in the men's prisons, even if they're not incarcerated currently for residential burglary, they have one further back on the record, then they can't get a job doing HVAC. So what point is it to have these HVAC classes where guys will take these classes literally and then get out and they can't get a job? So they're promised to be able to work. They're promised that these are living wage jobs and there's plenty of jobs available for it. But what they weren't told is if you have a residential burglary, then you're not going to be able to get a job doing it. So next is plumbing, right? So in the next couple pictures to go with that. The thing that they teach that we've been seeing with people reentering is they teach a certain style of plumbing that's good for industrial, but it's not good for residential. So guys get out learning what they learned with the plumbing, and they've been promised that, hey, these hours that you log in here are going to be transferable. Many times they're not transferable. And then secondly, they learn the wrong type of plumbing because they learned industrial plumbing rather than learning residential plumbing. And the prison system, and this isn't just a knock on the prison system. This is talking about what needs to be changed to break down some of these barriers to reentry, right? It's a prison system finds a way to benefit themselves when it comes to the training, because it's like, okay, we'll teach them plumbing, but then they have them going around the prison fixing all the things to do with the plumbing, right? But that's industrial plumbing, and it's not going to be what they're going to be doing for the most part outside of the prison system. So it's going to be harder to get a job. People are promised if they invest 2 years of their life taking these plumbing classes, they're going to get out and get a good job plumbing. And the truth of the matter is that that's highly unlikely. Next one. Welding. So welding classes are good in theory, but the welds they teach, again, are how to go around and fix the type of welds that are used inside of prisons. Oh, we need to fix this bunk. We need to do this, right? It's all geared towards what's going to benefit the Department of Corrections, so they don't have to pay a welder. Because, if they pay a welder, they're going to be paying some big money. But if you pay an inmate 42 cents an hour, then you're going to be saving a ton of money, and you're acting like you're giving them a trade. But I've seen many people come out and they try to get a job welding, and they took a welding class for 2 years, and the people on the job like, okay, look, we told you we'd give you a job, and just fortunately, some of them have been able to keep the job, but they're like, you're gonna have to go through training all over again because your welds are not what's actually used, and they're being taught stuff that's only good for doing the repairs around the prison and the welds that they use. So to be able to have the taxpayer dollars have the most bang for the buck, then these programs that are training people that are being sold to legislators as being beneficial to the individuals need to be practical and applicable upon the release. Next. Building maintenance. This is actually a good one, especially with all the building that's going on. A lot of people can't even find a place to rent. So this is actually one of the good ones. Is just, it's such a basic trade that it's something that a lot of people can learn on the job. When people sign up for the union, a lot of times they'll do all the training themselves, and it's really just some hands-on stuff that they're going to learn in short order. And a lot of money is being thrown to these classes that can be put towards something that's going to be more beneficial. Next. Correctional industries, also known as the mafia inside of prisons. So so they have the chair factory, and they also give another chair. I know I used to work in correctional industries. We used to put these chairs together, but then it got to the point to where some of the guys I knew who were still working in there, they're like, yo, we literally are ordering chairs from places like Staples, taking the labels off, putting a label on there saying correctional industries, and then reselling it to state agencies because state agencies are forced to buy from correctional industries, and then marking it up by $300-400 or more. So it's a way to turn a heavy profit. And Grady, you were saying something about this before? I know I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but you're very
Oh, no, absolutely. And what they did is they call that a pass-through. And so what they do is they order these products from different countries, from Malaysia or wherever they may order from. Just a really great example is like a dozen of washcloths. They may pay $1.10 for them, and for a dozen of washcloths, they'll charge DOC $12-13.
Okay. So next one. Furniture factory. A lot of the students, like the students at the UW, because they're told that people will be paid at the very least minimum wage inside of prisons, and of course that didn't happen. But the furniture factory is responsible for making a lot of the furniture for state agencies. And even with that, I knew a guy who, I'm not going to put his name out there because he's still incarcerated, but he was tasked with taking blueprints from online and making a couple changes and building stuff based off other people's blueprints that were intellectually copyrighted. You know what I mean? So there's things that, there's certain things when you're teaching somebody to do the right thing, and you're teaching somebody to live ethically, and then they're being taught these unethical practices, then what are you really training somebody to do once they get out? If you're teaching them how to bend the rules, break the rules, and that's what they were doing to come to prison in the first place. So when it comes to mitigating the barriers to reentry, one of those barriers has to be teaching people proper ethics and actually being that example yourself, and not bending it or making excuses because you have money to make. Next. License plates, like Grady was saying, unless you're coming back to prison, then where are you going to be making license plates at, right? And the final one is oh no, there's two more. The sign shops. A lot of people see the road signs. A lot of those were made inside of prisons through correctional industries. And then the final one, of course, is textiles and clothing factory. There's not many textile and clothing factory places. Between the year 2000 to 2010, 50,000 factories in the United States went to China. So, I mean, maybe somebody can go to China and get a job there. And the irony is they probably make the same wage that they were making while they were in prison. So, but these aren't really transferable jobs. And if you talk about the current flaws in the training programs and mitigating barriers to reentry, then there has to be jobs that have transferable application to society. Next slide.
Yeah, so I'm just going to read through some of this, and then I'm going to share a couple of personal experiences that I've had that I feel are dire for social preparation when you release. So proper communication skills, programs that promote social skills, incarcerated individuals teaching whenever possible, job interview skills, communicating with the opposite gender. So it's no shock that most of us that find ourselves in prison come from unhealthy homes, and the environments are toxic, and we just don't have the tools necessary to communicate in an effective manner. And for me, going to prison as a young kid, I was angry and hostile and had no idea how to communicate my needs. I spent the first 10 years of my life there in segregation, fighting on and off with the cops. And it wasn't until I started an education class that I started developing my own voice so I could articulate what I was thinking and feeling about a subject in an environment that I felt comfortable in a peer learning environment. And from there, I started branching out and getting involved in more groups, more classes. I eventually started peer supporting and helping other young girls that were coming in, learning how to articulate their needs. And I started developing leadership skills. Not only was I learning how to effectively communicate with the staff, but, being able to have a classroom and learn how to meet objectives and to vocalize certain things to other people. I think it's really important for people to experience that type of leadership, and it's frowned upon in the prisons. And it's really disheartening because there's a taboo about giving inmates authority and positions of power, but then they turn around and they, talk about recidivism rates and coping skills and the lack of being able to communicate. And yet there's so many opportunities to harness those skill sets inside of the prison system. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for a lot of the programs that I took that helped harness that. So some of the job interview skills, right? I was lucky enough to be a few of the individuals that were able to do mock interviews, and that was really insightful because going to an actual job interview is a skill set onto itself, right? But what's the point in learning how to nail the job interview if you can't even figure out how to upload the resume? So when I got home thinking, oh, I'm going to nail these interviews, I've got it figured out. And I don't even know, number one, how you actually find the job on the internet, because there's so many research databases out there, Indeed and this and that, right? But then how do you upload the resume? Half the time I didn't even know if the resume got actually uploaded. So I think it's in some ways great that they offer these, show you how to physically fill out a piece of paper, how to fill out your resume, and they definitely need to increase the mock interviews that they have with individuals in person, but they really need to bring in technology, even if it's just, closed circuit, so that people understand how to upload these resumes. And then communicating with the opposite gender. So this is something I never even really gave much thought to until I was released. I, didn't really communicate very much with the staff, for a long majority of my time. So there goes the men on that side, right? And there's such a taboo within prison about these boundaries that volunteers need to maintain. So any kind of interaction that you do have with the volunteer, it's very surface and unnatural, because everybody's walking around like on these eggshells for the majority of the time because of all these PREA codes and things that they tell, opposite genders and people coming in and volunteer. So when I was released, I had a male CCO, and there were some conditions that I had that were very personal I had to talk about. And I remember sitting down in the office with him, and I know how to communicate now. I know how to make my needs met, but I didn't know what to do with the fact that here I am sitting with a man and I don't really know what that looks like. Like, how much do I disclose? And it caused me to shut down a lot. And in retrospect, like, that's not good for anybody upon release, because your CCOs are supposed to be the ones there that you can confide into and to go to when you're having struggles or resources that you need. And I just think that that is something that hardly ever gets talked about, you know. Men, same thing with men, right? Like, what is it like being surrounded by men the majority of your life or for a couple of years, and then you get out and, you know, you're interacting with the opposite sex again? I think it's something that needs to be addressed and talked about a lot more. Yeah, so is there anybody else that wants to chime in on that?
Yeah, I know in the men's prisons, you have to be hypersensitive about the opposite gender, not only for just like general respects that most people are going to have anyway, right? But for it not to be perceived as something. I mean, yeah. I often tell the story about my friend he was talking to his mom, who was telling him about his wife, and his mom had just told him that his wife got diagnosed with breast cancer. So he grabbed his chest and he was like, breast cancer? And there was a female CEO about 30 feet away. She was a distance away, right? And she saw him grab his chest while he's on the phone. And she said, oh, he's talking about my breast. Wrote him up for a major sexual harassment, got him, you know, called the sergeant and everybody to bring him to the whole solitary confinement. And he went off, you know, because not only did he just find out his wife just got breast cancer, but he's like, look, I'm not a pervert. You know what I mean? But it's like being in that type of environment where you can be falsely accused. So you have to be even more sensitive than just general respect that you're going to have anyway. You have to think about, okay, I don't want to be perceived as, you know, this, and it just creates an awkward dynamic for people who don't have no type of interactions with the opposite sex, with staff, maybe working on programs or whatever. It really makes it awkward for a lot of people when they're released.
So I would like to chime in on the incarcerated individuals teaching whenever possible. I think the peer-to-peer education model is very, very vital to the communication aspect. So far, as I've seen, there's only one program, and there's another program actually where peer-to-peer is a part of their pedagogy. So, and that's really important, because when you learn from your peers, you tend to pay a lot more attention. You can relate to that individual. You know, you can understand them. And then when you include a popular education model, then that even makes it even greater, because you have a respect for each other's education, regardless of what class you're from, regardless of what race you're from, regardless of your age. So the importance of incarcerated individuals being able to teach whenever possible, it not only gives them skills to pass along, it gives them skills in order to be able to pass it. So I think that's a very, very important bullet point as well.
And even things like the volunteer system, right? Making it easier for volunteers to come into the prison systems, because a lot of times volunteers are discouraged or they're harassed when they come in, at least with some of the men's prisons from what I've seen, right? So making it easier so that you could have the volunteer programs like Toastmasters, to where people can actually just practice speaking abilities and being able to, you know, if you can get up in front of a crowd and you can speak to a group of individuals, then, you know, that breaks down a lot of those fears a lot of people have with public speaking. And then when you have the individualized speaking, it makes it that much easier, in my opinion. So, I mean, making access to prisons, having them not be so siloed out to where it's hard for people to get inside of those walls, I think would be highly beneficial as well. Next slide. Technological training. Currently, prisons are technological dead zones. It is so anti-technology for the incarcerated that the mere conversation of expanded technology causes intense debate among some staff. So, and cell phones are a perfect example of this change. And the pictures, 1980s, early 1990s. It looks like the World War II walkie-talkies. You know, you're walking down the street with a briefcase. Unless people are old enough, they probably don't even remember this, but I mean, it's just, it's absurd, right? But when you talk about technology inside of prisons, and there's people that who I've spoken to who work for Microsoft say, yeah, we have the ability to have secure internet to where, you know, they can make a secure internet for the prison system. And but people are so opposed to it but they're just opposed to any type of change and any type of advancement. I remember back when they got CD players inside of prison, right? You heard some staff saying, well, what if they use a laser beam to cut through the bars and come out the cell? And it's like, okay, so you're gonna come out the cell and be outside of the cell where you go when you go anywhere throughout the day anyway, right? Or you're gonna cut through the back window and if you're skinny enough, squeeze through the little gap and be outside of the unit to where, you know, you're going to be walking around and going to the gym or going to eat or whatever during the day anyway, right? I mean, it was completely irrational. And plus, you know, none of us are MacGyver, right? Creating a laser beam is going to cut with a CD player, right? But these are the type of arguments you hear, right? And you hear other people make the arguments when it comes to internet saying, well, what if people get online and they do something they're not supposed to be doing? Well, if they do get online, they do something they're not supposed to be doing, do the same thing that you would do if somebody did it outside of prison. And a simple solution to that could be in each prison to have a unit that's a technology-free zone. And everywhere else, you have the technology. So the people who violate the access to technology, they'll spend a certain amount of time in those dead zones units where they want to have access to the technology due to the violation. And then they can try to earn their way back and have access again. If they mess up, go right back and you know, but don't punish everybody and don't exclude everybody, because a lot of people, especially during the onset to mass incarceration, people, every one of us on the screen right now, right? When we had gotten out, we had never seen a smartphone. We never see. I don't even know if they're called smartphones anymore. I think they're just called phones, right? But we had never seen one. So not only did we have to adjust to society, we had to adjust to the technology because we hadn't been prepared for the technology. I know I used to read magazines and stuff. I mean, anybody else could chime in, but I know you're really starting behind when you need your phone for pretty much everything.
No, it's real. I mean, I felt like my first probably week out, and I still don't know how to fully use my phone, but I think that that's kind of the norm for everybody.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows everything their phone does. However, the first week out, I had so many moments of panic when I was expected to do something with my phone, pay with my phone, look at a menu with my phone, register for something with my phone, try to get an ID. I mean, there were so many things that this little device was expected to do. And I also felt like I wasn't supposed to have it because I spent so long with that being like, that would have been bad. It would have, like, and then I was worried I was going to break it. I mean, there were so many things that I cried. And then I also spent like vital hours that I really wanted to have with my family, just trying to figure out how to do things with my phone. And not fruitful things. I wasn't playing Candy Crush. Like, I just wanted to be able to function and seem semi-normal. So that as I went around, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, my phone is going to, that was how you were supposed to navigate. That's how I had to figure out what bus I needed to be on. And I didn't even barely know how to turn it on.
Which feeds into the next slide, that anxiety. Next slide. Mental health and wellness. Somebody want to read this?
Yeah, so mental health and wellness, dehumanizing conditions, stress, remorse, shame, guilt, humiliation, lack of purpose, contribute to deteriorate mental health. How do we establish a trusted non-adversarial system in which people can get the treatment they need before they are released? So I know I speak to many, many people who've been released and are releasing, and no matter how difficult or seamless your transition is, I think every single person here today and every person that's been released deals with mental health and wellness. And what's really, really sad is that I know in the women's prison, I'm assuming the same in the men's prison, you can't even get therapy unless you are diagnosed or there's a legit crisis in your life. So you wanting to go to therapy to talk about the issues that brought you to prison or past traumas or PTSD that you may be having while in prison or upon release, like, you can't get it. And it's so underfunded. And there's an article that was just recently released that is, you know, talking about how underfunded mental health is in the prisons in Washington and how it's leading to increased rates and segregation spikes. Like, more people are finding themselves in segregation because they're unable to go to mental health to get all of the treatment needs that they need, or just basic, you know, therapy to help you deal with all the trauma that comes with prison.
Yeah, and then you go to segregation where it increases your mental health issues, right? So it's just
Right?
like this vicious cycle where it just builds on itself. And then there's also the reality in prisons where anything that the doctor or a therapist, if you do see one, puts in your file, that could be used against you later on. It's not like being out in society and going to seeing a therapist. Anything they work for the Department of Corrections, so anything that you say, regardless if they quote you right, it can later be used against you and affect your life in a negative manner, or affect your release in a negative manner. And it's another thing that keeps people from getting the treatment, even if they're able to get the treatment, is not trusting the system and not trusting they're going to get proper treatment.
So a very quick point on the latter part of this slide, when we talk about before they are released, actually,
Yeah.
I mean, and there's another element that I think we need to actually even look at as well. I served 37 years of incarceration consistent, no breaks, no releases, no coming back.
Yeah.
No one, absolutely no counselor, no administrator, no one say, hey, Mr. Mitchell, do you need any kind of mental health support? Hey, Mr. Mitchell, do you need to be referred to a mental health counselor to help with your reentry, to help with your readjustment? No one asked for that. You know, fortunate enough, my support network was in place, but once again, it took extraordinary efforts to get that stuff in place, and that's not the norm. That should not be the norm.
Yeah.
I would also like to add, so something that WCCW did that I feel like should really be modeled for other prisons is that they had a social worker that worked there. And that social worker was responsible. Granted, we had a smaller population, but still close to 1,000 people at its highest. And we had a social worker who was responsible for getting you connected to all the things that you would need when you released, but she worked in mental health. And so even if you had not been to mental health before, you would have to go to that building in order to access her. And she was plugged in with all the therapists. So there was always this element of like, let me help you in a way that is actually fruitful. Let me look up and make sure you get your food stamps that you need, but also like, how are you doing? And let me check on like your coping skills at this time. And you know what? I think you should talk to my friend, Dr. Brody, instead of it being like a very formal kind of thing, right? And then you might get that plug in. Why do you have to have that to get into mental health? Who knows? But that system, to informalize it in that way, seemed to actually change some of the dynamic around, like we had talked about, healthy ways of framing seeking out mental health versus this like stigma of, oh, you're broken, bro.
Exactly.
You shouldn't go access that, or you shouldn't even say that you need help. And so, and for her to be doing that, like I said, it just seemed like a model, whether they intended it to be that way or not, it seemed like a model that could really be fruitful for other places to look at and to use. Not to mention all the things that a social worker like should work inside of a prison. Yeah. And why that is not a normal thing, I don't know. But it was one element of WCCW that probably worked the best.
Yeah, I'd agree that they should have that everywhere. And somebody had pointed out in the chat that, you know, even if somebody is receiving these services inside of prison, they only have a couple weeks worth of medication when they're released. And if it's one of these rapid resentencings, right? I even seen a guy who got out and they're like, sorry, we don't have time to use your medication. So he was taking half of his sisters because his sister was out here and they're just splitting pills, you know what I'm saying? Until he can get on state insurance and be able to get the medicine he needed. Next slide. So proper documentation upon release. You want to take this, Grady?
Absolutely. So proper documentation upon release, we're talking state ID card, your social security card, birth certificate, and the medical insurance. Now, naturally, they have on paper, they have a process in place. And we can start off with the identification card. 5 years ago, the Jay Inslee executed Executive Order 1605. And that would ensure that the mechanism would be in place for people that were releasing to get their identification cards. So it's a necessity upon one's return. I don't really need to list the effects of not having an ID card. I think everyone on the panel and everyone that's in attendance would know if you don't have an ID card, the problems you're going to be faced with, an ID card or a driver's license. So in order to, even when you release, you have a $40 stipend check, and you have a savings if you have that. And unfortunately, I didn't have any savings because I was serving a life sentence. So I only had a $40 check. Now, in order to go and even get the ID card, it costs $54. So there goes that $40, but you have to be able to cash that $40 check. You don't have an ID card. So the mechanism that's supposed to be in place, that's on paper being in place, is you have to be within 6 months of your release. 45 days prior to that, you get with your caseworker and they begin the application process to have a state ID ready. They'll submit an electronic verification letter in your file. And once you release, you go down to DOL within, I think it's like 10 days or 7 days. And you'll be able to present your prison ID card and you'll get a state ID card because everything is in the paper. I went through that process. And my counsel even assured me, everything's taken care of, you're good to go to DOL. When I was released, got out 3 days. 3 days later, I went down to DOL. They knew absolutely zero about me. They didn't know what I was or why I was. Fortunately, again, because I took extraordinary measures in becoming aware of reentry, and I used to actually facilitate programs in prison about things like that. And Mr. Powers was actually one of them that included me in that fold, is that I had other documents with me just in case. And those other documents were social security cards and things of that nature. So that could very easily have begun a cycle of stress and frustration. And it was just because of being involved in this system that basically just set you up for that failure. That's really, really important. I don't think we can emphasize enough about the Social Security card. People want to see the physical Social Security card. If you're on the streets, you need all sorts of documentation to get a Social Security card. The process should be available, once again, in prison for you to do that. I know at one facility I was at, they said, no, we don't even do it. And it's apparently a policy where you could apply to get your card and they would apparently keep it for you, or you could go and pick it up. I'm not sure which one it is. But one facility said, no, we don't do it. Social Security officers don't even recognize us. I'm like, what? Same thing with the medical insurance. They do have the Apple Health. As sporadic as that may be, I was able to transfer and get on my wife's. I was in a very exceptional position, but I cannot believe that I fell through the cracks here. I cannot believe that I just slipped through a little crack. And I can assure you from the stories that I've heard and for the people that I've talked with, that I'm not the only one that this has applied to.
Yeah. And I was writing him months before he got out saying, hey, give this to the counselor, double check it, but we won't. He did everything that he needed to do. But sometimes it does work, and sometimes everything is in place. Alyssa, you want to say what it looks like when things work out?
This little group of people likes to joke that my way was paved with golden bricks. But it's true. So that's the thing that it's hard to hear, that there are so many cases where it doesn't work when you actually know that the things are in place for this to work. So when we're like bringing up all of these things, these are needs for somebody releasing, we're not bringing them up because like we're shooting a rock into a pond. Like we are actually bringing up things that have proven to work. I released, I had my identification already at the prison before I left, my social security card, my insurance was already active, and I stepped out and received my EBT card to have food stamps in the mail and had them immediately. So those were 4 things that were necessary, right? In order to get a bank account, I had to have an ID and a social security card. In order to eat, if I hadn't had family there, I needed to be able to go to a grocery store with more than the little bit of money that I left with and be able to feed myself. I mean, they were small things. I needed to be able to go and get a pair of glasses because thanks to COVID, like things weren't happening inside of the prison either. So there were things that I needed to do that required those 4 things. And do I still need them? No, not necessarily. Like once I got on my feet, but they were things that I needed right away. And to know that it could have been provided for everyone and wasn't is really sad when I do know that those systems are in place. Those resources are there. And I, again, will just reiterate that the social worker that worked at WCCW made sure that those things were in place for me.
And that's how it should be for everybody, right? So,
Right.
I mean, that
Absolutely.
really shows the what success looks like, what a proper system looks like. And somebody was just asking in the chat about how the pandemic has affected the the difficulty levels of getting these documents. And with my job, being helping people get these things, and it's way worse. It's multiplied it so many times over just to be able to get state ID, driver's license, social security card. They want you to mail your state ID or driver's license to Social Security for them to mail you back. And people are like, man, I'm not doing that.
No.
Right? Whereas before you can just go in. But during the pandemic, they're not allowing people to go in, and it's really making things very, very difficult. Next slide. Necessary resources upon release: housing, employment, clothing, food, and cell phone. And we're actually going to break out on these. So next slide. Housing.
All right, so housing, a lack of housing all too often leads to homelessness, obviously, which potentially compounds mental health issues, substance abuse, and recidivism. And while that seems like an obvious statement, many people who are getting out of prison in desperation to just have an address to release to, they're going to places that are not safe for them. They're going to communal living like transition housing, which could or could not be good for someone. They may be returning to the same place that they came from that maybe will exacerbate the same exact issues that existed that sent them to prison in the first place. So housing can be this really like complex issue that it's a need that must be met immediately. And then moving forward, even if you release and you're like, okay, I'm going to get my own place, I'm going to handle that. There's things in place that prevent you from being able to do that. One, if you don't have any rental history, which most people who have served a significant amount of time, I never rented a place myself. All the people that are in this particular talk probably never had places of their own. And so you have that issue. If you don't have any credit, which how would you have credit? My gold paved road, I had a student loan that I paid off. So I released from prison with credit. And so that was the only reason that I was able to apply for an apartment to get an apartment. But had I not done that, my partner still has no credit at all. And it's been months. So the fact of the matter is credit doesn't just happen overnight. It's that thing that you build on, and people who are listening, and you guard your credit history with your life, right? You're working on that credit score. But there's also the huge problem of no anti-discriminatory housing, with the exception of King County. So people don't release in Washington just to King County. I don't know if anybody in this room thinks that everybody goes to King County, but they sure don't. So the fact of the matter is that people release to all counties, and King County is the only place that maybe or maybe not runs a background check. And that might be 7 years, or they might not ask at all. So there's this really tricky situation where people are releasing to other counties, but they're not able to access housing in any way, shape, or form because they're automatically shut down because of a felony record. So, and it doesn't matter the age of that thing. You don't have rental history, you don't have credit, and you have a felony. Like there's no way that somebody's willing to take a chance on you. So then slowly we're all forced into the most expensive county in the whole state to live in. And so we're all trying to make ends meet. And sure, you might get a minimum wage job, maybe. And then you're making just enough to scrape by to make a rent, and you're hoping that you can make it from month to month. So the fact of the matter is that stable housing is a resource that should be in place, and yet it is like one of the most shaky things, so that you're seeing people that are releasing and they're just releasing to a month away from homelessness, which is really not a safe place for people to be. Sorry, no, unless you guys have something to add, if we're ready for the next slide.
Yeah, next slide. Employment. Gail?
Yeah, so employment restrictions need to be stripped away through legislation. There also must be real and true consequences for companies who discriminate despite current laws on the books. Practical laws, unlike the current 7-year background check, or if a person has been released in the past 7 years. This makes it impractical survival gauntlet for 7 years, and if they survive, that they can have more access. So just like housing, unemployment is so tricky. There are so many people I know that have released, and I included for a long, long time, that was looking for work and just immediately like denied. And thankfully, like there's been some legislation that's passed that has banned, in some areas. But again, you have companies that will deny you based on your background check because their insurance company that they go through, their corporation and their insurance company says, oh, well, we have to get insured through them. And so they run their own private background check, and it'll be up to them whether or not you can be employed. So how am I supposed to find somewhere to live, with all the hurdles Alyssa just talked about, but then be able to get employment when a lot of the skills I learned. So I did Braille transcription, which is crazy hard to learn. And the skill sets that came with that, I should have been set for life in a career, right? 10 years doing Braille transcription and told over and over through CI, you're going to get a career upon the release, don't worry about anything else. So I thought, believing correctional industries, motto that, they're to help you to, transition into a career. No, nobody's hiring me for Braille work upon release. Like, it's just not happening. It's a very small field. It's very competitive. And then the skill sets you need to learn how to the technology out here to do it, they don't teach you that in there. So I shuffled around trying to figure out how to upload resumes and trying to find a job, and it wasn't happening. It wasn't without my own networking that I developed, and I was able to, use the skills that I had learned on my own as a person to show people I do have assets, even though I can't place them on a resume, that I was able to land myself some employment. But yeah, like there just needs to be more done on big corporations that are keeping people, blocked out completely of these jobs, because people want to succeed. I think that's not what, is missing, is that people, when they get out, they want to stay out of prison. They want to get a house. They want to get a job. They want to be proud of the things that they, are going to accomplish. And it's just one barrier after another that, creates recidivism.
Yeah, when people see individuals go back to prison, but they don't see all the struggles when they're trying to get a job to stay out of prison. Next slide. Clothing. So having a few changes of clothes. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the importance of this work outfit, just comfort clothes, your underwear, t-shirt, socks. These are things that that sometimes when we talk about releasing and reentry, we're just totally oblivious to this. And I mean, just imagine for years of having these type of decisions already made for you. We didn't have to worry about what type of clothes we were going to wear and when we were going to get them, and every 90 days or 6 months you can go and exchange them for the same style and thing, and it might be someone else that wore those clothes. So you don't know what you were getting. But this is a very, very instrumental key factor, and I would just like to share that, and when we come from this and we talk about navigating through a lot of the unfamiliarity with the basic necessities of the personal hygiene, your food and clothing, I mean, these things, after having them decided for so long, I mean, this could really become a stressor for you. I experienced it personally. I personally experienced for years, I've been telling, hey man, don't be overwhelmed with choices. Don't be overwhelmed with all these things, And so I was really doing great. Anthony, man, and just that association with him and I don't know if we have a slide further down to cover this, but I'm gonna be very, very quick here. It's just the mere fact of him being there with me and going through it. First, he had to make me understand, listen, prison sizes and society sizes is two different sizes.
Yeah.
That's the first thing you need to understand, you know? And then he started noticing everything I was picking was sort of tan and khaki. You know what I mean? It's like, wait a minute, this is 37 years of conditioning. So, and so immediately I'm saying, okay, well, I can get through this. And I was doing really, really well until we got to some blue jeans and I panicked. I just literally became overwhelmed. And the mere fact, and I remember going and grabbing my wife, hugging her, and just knowing Anthony was there gave me the sense that he knew the other individuals with us. He was basically give him a couple minutes. He's tripping, but he's not tripping. You know, he just give him a couple minutes. But it gave me the confidence and the courage and the strength not to feel embarrassed or naive, but to push through that overwhelmness. So that is really, really important. Of the familiar face while we're doing these things here. Because like I said, for years, I've expressed this exact point to individuals. Hey, man, don't be overwhelmed with the choices when you get out there. You can say that all you want to until you experience it.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we've been fortunate to do at the Seattle Clemency Project is, we recognize this is one of the barriers to reentry, not having clothes. You're released with one outfit and $40. And I mean, if people have been incarcerated for any amount of time, imagine being dropped in a city where you have little to no contacts with one outfit and $40. I know one guy, he was released in the middle of winter and a homeless guy saw him and he could tell that he'd been in prison because a homeless guy had been in prison, right? And the homeless guy was like, "Hey man, you just got out, huh?" He's like, "Yeah." And he didn't even have a jacket. So the homeless guy took off his jacket and then said, "Hey, you need to use my phone." And he was able to call somebody to come pick him up, But through the Seattle Clemency Project, and I know this is one thing I was just joking with my executive director there is that, people hear the Seattle Clemency Project and they think, lawyers have money. We must have a bunch of money, right? It's like, not really. We always have to raise money, right? So we raise money to help people with these things because, it's one of the biggest things that people need. So we try to raise money to make sure that people getting out, they at least have a few outfits. Next slide. Food. Being able to eat staves off desperation and turn to easy money. Though a grocery store tends to be overwhelming in the beginning. That's one of the things that Grady was just touching on. And you can see it in, this is Freddie right here. You can see it in his face. He was shook up, right? And I mean, right after I took this picture of him, because he was just looking around like, and this is after we had been there for a little while. And then he was like, "Man, this is kind of overwhelming." And then I was just joking with him. I was saying, "Man, But it's one of those things. You haven't been in a grocery store for years. You're in an environment where you have to watch your surroundings, and then people are brushing up behind you and everything else and walking all over the place. And we were talking about the opposite gender. You got the opposite gender. You got kids. You got all these different dynamics that you're not used to, including this big old building with all these different things going on, and it can be a bit overwhelming. I know somebody had a question in the chat talking about credit scores and reports, and when do things like owed restitution and attorney fees hit someone's credit score? I'm not familiar with the answer to this, but if anybody else has the answer, I'm inviting you to answer.
Well, there's several ways you can address your credit score. I mean, if you can become a secondary on someone's primary account, you can begin to establish yourself into the financial system or computer. So I don't know what the exact question was.
The question was about how restitution and attorney fees can negatively affect your credit score. And if so, when does that happen?
I don't think so.
It doesn't show up.
Yeah.
So the downside is that when you do pay off on it, because a lot of times your checks or different income you have is goes directly towards your LFOs, it doesn't reflect your credit score at all. Okay. So the fact that you're paying off a debt or that you're in debt, Okay. I just want to highlight one thing really quick on the grocery store that I think doesn't get talked. Well, maybe it does get talked about. Is I had no idea how to pay for anything, so I got dropped off at a few different places so I could take my time, looking at the grocery stores, the shopping mall, and I had the worst anxiety because I had cash I don't have credit cards at that point, and I didn't even know certain machines would take them. Like, I know that in some states, they're starting to implement a virtual reality set, especially for those who've done over 10 years. And so you can do virtual reality and learn how to check out things from the grocery store or get a visual of how much things have changed, so it's not so anxiety producing upon release. And I think it's something that Washington State should really look into.
Most definitely.
So one last issue on food, I know we have to get through this, is that I went with the individual just recently. He went to the store and said, okay, go ahead, get what you want, don't worry, I'll pay for it. He came back with Doritos, summer sausage, cheese whiz. I mean, and for those because you know, he came back with, he didn't even know how to shop. He didn't know anything
Back
about
with
the
commissary.
fresh
Yeah,
vegetables.
commissary, exactly. Squeeze cheese. Next slide.
I love some cheese squeeze.
Cell phones. So modern society requires that we have a cell phone. Despite this, most people who are released neither have a cell phone, nor can they afford a bill until they secure a job and get on their feet. So another thing that we do with Seattle Clemency Project is we use some of the money that we raise to give people cell phones, and then we pay 3 months in advance. And again, if you don't have a credit score, you know, they're not even going to let you get a cell phone a lot of times. So we get it on their behalf and pay the first few months, during which time we can try to help them get a job and everything else, and hopefully they can pay the bill from there. So next slide.
You want to cover this one, Grady?
Yeah. So the association is really significant when we talk about that. I shared briefly about just the importance of that when Anthony was there for me. But I also would just like to share a very interesting stat that was taken from the quantitative criminal justice and criminology. They took an extensive look into examining the needs of people released from prison. Now, their work revealed that among the most frequently expressed desired forms of social support were a peer mentor to guide them to make everyday decisions. And what came out of this report is they found that those who were mentored were 35% less likely to recidivate after 1 year. So when the needs and challenges are beyond the scope of what traditional non-peer mentoring actually needs, just having that familiar face there, the significance is really, really great. The problem is that due to CCOs or due to conditions and things of this nature, you're not allowed to have associations with people that have ex-felons, or they have felonies on their record. I mean, and if you do, it could very easily be a violation of your conditioning, can return you back to prison. Keep in mind, I'll use myself as an example. 37 years, I've formed many friendships, many relationships with individuals, you know, that are, some are even vicariously living through me now. And now I'm not allowed to associate with them. So this is a really, really problem area for me. And that healthy social network now makes you accountable. Even when we talk about your family, we talk about those that were instrumental in getting your release. You know, you become accountable to them. They become your support network. And so that should be all inclusive and not that, you know, I've heard the adage earlier that it's about it take a village to raise a child. We have to be careful because sometimes if the whole village is kind of messed up, what kind of child are you going to get?
Next slide. So solutions. And you know, we got 5 minutes. So the remedy in many of these barriers is to include more people who have successfully managed to reintegrate back into society, so that they can lend both their voices and their experience to working towards necessary changes. I know there's a lot of popularity around that geared towards people with lived experience. Allow for more healthy communication, family relationship classes on the inside. And formerly incarcerated should be fully reintegrated, fully integrated back into society. When people feel a part of the community, they're less likely to victimize that community. You know, when you have this us versus them system where people are isolated who are coming back out of prison, that really just makes for a less safe community, because when people feel included, they're less likely to victimize somebody who they feel included with. So next slide, as we close out. I'll say my closing remarks, and then I'll let my team say their closing remarks. There's many barriers to reentry, and you know, we have to look at these things as a full picture and really invest in coming up with solutions to all of these things, working together and finding these commonalities. And one of the things now with all the reforms that are happening, you know, with three-strikes reform, juvenile reform, et cetera, it's not the usual that attorneys are used to. Attorneys and judges are used to things on the front end. So now with things being resolved on the back end, then attorneys really need to start focusing on how does reentry apply to my client, and then not just, you know, they're about to get sentenced, but when it comes to resentencing, how do I make sure that my client is set up as much as in my ability to get them lined up with who they need to be lined up with, so that they can be successful and not return to prison after they're released.
For sure. So the bottom line is that, like, releasing is complex. It's complicated and it's hard. It's not just hard for the person that's going through it. It's hard for their family members. It's hard for their loved ones. It's a time of finding independence. And then it's also a time where you're wholly dependent on everyone else. The needs for release, they should be met by resources that are already available. They might be met by some degree, but they're not slotted for people who are formerly incarcerated. Or if they are, it's not a well-oiled machine. It's something that we need to work on. These resources should be able to help where family and friends are unable, and they should be most supportive where people who are freshly freed are the most vulnerable. These needs, they're not extravagant. So all the things that we've gone over today, they're the basic things that you take for granted. It's coming home to a safe house after working a long day. It's having an ID to present so that you can prove who you are. It's having the ability to apply for something, knowing that you have some sort of credit to support it. It's knowing that you have someone to call that can actually empathize with what you've been through. It's having clothes to put on that are appropriate for the occasion. So they aren't things that we're not asking for the moon. We don't want to release and drive a Benz. We don't need to go to a mansion. We just want stability. And now is actually the time to stop hoping that we can mitigate the barriers. Now is the time to act on those things. Now's the time to make those resources normalized so that we're not just saying, oh, one person was paved with gold, right? We don't want just the one exception. We want that to be the norm so that everyone can get out and contribute to society in the way that taxpayers hope that that system works. That's what we're asking for.
I just want to add one thing really quick. That was beautiful, Alyssa. Reentry starts before you're released, and coping skills is a must. And we need to figure out a way to bring more coping skills into the prisons. Otherwise, you're going to have continual recidivism rates, because there's so many barriers and it's going to take years to address these issues. But we can one by one get people in their mind right to deal with all of these anxieties and pressures when they get released. And I just appreciate everybody being here today and listening to what we had to say.
So of all the multitude of reentry service available, I would just like to say the peer mentorship should actually be a feature of reentry and prioritized, but it's often overlooked by the reentry services of Washington, and that should be changed.
Yeah.
Do we have time left? Do we have, no.
Perfect timing, perfect, you know?
Perfection.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I want to thank our panelists again for providing such personal and concrete information on what we can do to mitigate these barriers. So a very, very big thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. We are right at time. That was perfect timing. It's exactly 3:30. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
You as well.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.